archive it for the center. Okay, I'm going to let everyone in. Hello, welcome. Hello.
Oh.
Welcome. It's so nice to see everyone. Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Robert Myers. I am the director for the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Beirut, and also a professor of English. I'm very pleased to welcome you to CASAR's first event of the spring semester in what's been a very troubling, difficult time for everyone I know. And this panel is, I think, one of the most expansive, interesting panels that we've had in recent years. I couldn't be happier to have the participants that we have. It's called Extraction Economies and Indigenous Societies in the Americas. And our three guests, I'm going to introduce all three, and then each will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for your comments, your questions. Before I do, I would like to, first of all, thank our co-sponsors. Ask everybody to put your mute on. If you have not, please turn the mute on. I'd like to thank Rami Houri and the Global Engagement Initiative at AUB's office in New York, and the English department at AUB, which there are co-sponsors here today. And I want to alert you to two items. One is that CASAR has recently sent out a call to AUB faculty. For those of you who are AUB faculty, we're very interested in heuristic projects, ones that have a practical effect on the community. Obviously, Lebanon and the region are going through very difficult times, so we're very focused on trying to support projects that will have a direct impact in Beirut, in Lebanon, in the region, and will bring theory and practice together. And if you have any questions about those, please email either me, Robert Myers, at RM33, or Iman Al-Kaizi, who's the program coordinator at CASAR. So that's number one. The other thing is I want to alert you to the three other events that we have scheduled. They're all part of our theme for this year and next, which is called Environments East and West. And those events, we'll be co-sponsoring those events with William Hoffman and the Global Engagement Initiative in New York. They're scheduled for March 10, 31, and April 21st, and they are also all related to the environment, to quality of life. And again, you know, we're hoping very much to do this because we want very much to have a direct impact. So if you have any questions at all, please contact me. I'm so thrilled to see everybody here. Let me see if I can let the people in who are still waiting. Hi, Josh. There's Asya and Josh. Okay. Welcome. I'd like to welcome you, all of you. It's really wonderful you're here. Our first speaker is going to be Leo Bernucci, who I've known for 30 years and admired his work since he was a professor of mine at Yale. He's the distinguished professor of He's a distinguished professor of Spanish, the Russell F. and Jean H. Fidiment Chair in Latin American Studies at the University of California, Davis. he has many publications, but some of his most recent and significant are, first of all, his work on Euclides da Cunha, who is one of the major Brazilian writers, certainly of the 19th century, is best known for a book called Rebellion in the Backlands, which is a classic of world literature and Latin American literature. So he has a number of publications on Euclides. And he also has a wonderful book that I just reread called, in Portuguese, Paraíso Suspeito, A Voragem Amazônica, which is translated as Suspect Paradise, the Amazonian Vortex. Our second speaker will be Anne Spice, who is an assistant, acting assistant professor at Ryerson in Toronto. She's in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. She is a Tlingit member of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and self-described queer, indigenous, feminist, and anti-colonial organizer. And she's a PhD candidate in anthropology at CUNY's Graduate Center. And our final speaker will be my friend and colleague, Adam Waterman, who's associated with the Center for American Studies, who received his degree in American Studies from NYU. He's an assistant professor of American Literature and Culture in the Department of English at AUB. His research focuses on the relationship between literature, historiography, and the culture of American settler colonialism. His forthcoming book from Fordham University Press, which is quite impressive piece of work, is called The Corpse in the Kitchen, History, Embodiment, and the Haunting of American Settler Colonialism, which, among many other things, is about the so-called Blackhawk Wars in North America. Okay, with that protracted introduction, I'm really thrilled to have Leo Bernucci here talk a bit about his recent work that I just discussed.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you again for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And good morning, good afternoon, good night to each one of you. I don't know exactly where you are. I'm here in California. It's a little bit past 9 a.m., so it's still early. I try to organize these few remarks that I'm about to deliver to you um, around the topic that Robert suggested, which has to do obviously with extraction economies. And so I'll talk about this topic in the context of the Amazon. As he mentioned to you, I published a book and a major Latin American novel, which relies very heavily on the historical record. And so I'm going to be starting by talking about this historical record, so we all can understand a little bit more easily what the Colombian writer Jose Eustacio Rivera, who is the author of La Vorágine, translated as The Vortex, did in this exceptional novel, in my view. Um, the story or the history, let's probably use the word history because it is history, um, begins with Leopold II's administration of the independent state of Congo, or ironically, Congo Free State, which was characterized by atrocities, including torture and murder, resulting from notorious brutality. In 1890, and I'll give you a few dates here because I think it will help us understand where we want to arrive with this novel by Rivera that was published in 1924. But we'll go back to 1890. Um, and I would like to point out that the American Civil War Black soldier, Baptist minister, politician, journalist, and also writer on African American history, George Washington Williams. He coined the term crimes against humanity to describe the practices of Leopold II of Belgium's administration of the Congo Free State. That year, after traveling in the Congo, he was shocked by the widespread brutal abuses imposed upon the Congolese rubber extractors. He wrote an open letter to Leopold II, and this letter produced an immediate international outcry against the horrific regime installed in the Congo. The hands of men, women, and children were amputated when the quota of rubber was not met, and millions of Congolese people died. Colonial accounts typically emphasized Leopold's modernizing changes in the Congo and not the genocide he facilitated. The typical dichotomy, um, as we know, progress and barbarism, right? Or civilization and barbarism. So, in the name of the so called civilization, all these atrocities were committed. Also, in 1890, the Irish nationalist Roger Casement, who had been in Africa since 1884 when he joined the British colonial service, met Joseph Conrad, who, as we know, would later write Heart of Darkness in 1899. This meeting took place in the Congo. And in 1901, the same Casement left the colonial service to join the Foreign Office, becoming consul in the eastern part of the French Congo. In 1903, now a consul in the Congo, Casement was commissioned by the House of Commons to investigate human rights abuse in that territory. In the following year, 1904, Casement writes a devastating report known as the Casement Report. Despite Leopold's effort to refute Casement's findings, his report had a powerful impact on the public opinion in Europe. Now we'll jump to 1908. The Belgian parliament took over the Congo Free State from Leopold and organized its administration as the Belgian Congo. This was 1 year before this horrible king died in 1909. In 1910, now in Brazil, we'll go back to Casement, as British consul in Santos, then in Pará, this is in the Amazon, and in Rio de Janeiro, now as consul general, he would enter a similar scenario to the one he found in Africa, but now in the Amazon. Casement was called by the British government to investigate similar criminal practices observed in Africa, now by mainly the Peruvian Amazon Company, so called PAC, which was registered in England in 1908 and had approximately 40 British subjects, Barbadians, working for the company's major owner, the Peruvian rubber baron Julio Cesar Arana. As he had done for the Congo, Casement writes another powerful report for the British government denouncing similar atrocities committed in the rubber states of the Putumayo and Caquetá regions. I have a map here. I don't know if later we can have maybe a minute to look at the map, Robert, but if we don't, I can go back there and specify a little bit where this area is. So as you can see, Casement work was essential to open this door for others to come and start looking at this horrific problem that PAC had created for the indigenous, mainly for the indigenous people in the Amazon. In his diaries, in Casement's diaries, he talks about approximately 30,000 deaths during a period of about 5 to 6 years. 30,000 lives were taken from the indigenous uh, population. So you can see that since we don't have a very good statistics about these deaths because they were kind of hidden in the forest, right? Very difficult uh, to count these deaths. There is only estimates, but when you compare the different records, I think it's fair to say that the number is much larger. Obviously, in Africa, the number was explosive. It was in the millions. Um, so this is Caseman. His work was known by different people. There are two people, very important writers. One is Walt Hardenberg, who wrote a very powerful book titled The Putumayo, The Devil's Paradise, published in 1912. And then the British editor of the magazine Truth, Sidney Paternoster. And Paternoster uh, followed on the same recipe that Hardenberg had used in his book in 1913 and published The Lords of the Devil's Paradise, also very powerful account about what was happening in the Putumayo and Caqueta area. And that area, again, is on the border with Colombia, what it nowadays what it is now, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. There was a lot of dispute, litigious dispute between Brazil and Peru and Colombia and Venezuela also, but Colombia and Peru were also in very tense, in a very tense situation in that part of the territory. Um, I give you this background because I spoke before of the historical record. And the historical record amounts to being not only this powerful report that Caseman wrote, and then the two books that I mentioned, but also I would like to give credit to a very obscure and courageous journalist named Benjamin Saldaña Roca, ROCCA. Benjamin Saldaña Roca was established in Iquitos, and he founded weekly, two weekly newspapers, and his newspapers were La Sanción, Sanction, and La Felpa. Um, and he titled them literary, political, and commercial newspapers, right? Those literary interests me because I study literature. Um, so I began to look at this newspaper, and and I found so many interesting things that I decided with a former graduate student of mine to publish uh, everything that we could possibly find because it's not very easy to find all the different issues that were published. The collection is housed at the University of at Oxford University in the Rhodes Library, but it's incomplete. But why am I talking about this journalist? Because in 1907, he arrives in Iquitos in 1906, but in 1907 is the date when one of his newspapers, it's first published. It began to change things in Iquitos. What were these things? The way Arana, the famous Peruvian rubber baron, would do his tricks in that city, which was very important. There were three very important cities in those days in the Amazon: Iquitos, Manaus, and Belém do Pará. Right. So Iquitos uh, was Arana's main place, and he had offices also in Manaus. And being the powerful guy that he was, and rich and famous in the area, he would dominate the entire city by corrupting judges, politicians, and offering bribes of all sorts of for all sorts of things that he wanted to do. For silencing also journalists. So when Benjamin Saldaña Roca begins to denounce the atrocities committed in Arana's rubber states, um, he begins to realize that it's going to be difficult and dangerous, right? But nonetheless, he continues and he published his two newspapers until 1908, when he finally, under life threat and many other kinds of bully practices, he had to quit and leave Iquitos. These two newspapers were read by Casement. So Casement did the investigation in 1907, 1910, I'm sorry. But in 1907, 1908, these denunciations had already been placed in these two weekly papers. So these two papers are very, very important, and they are probably the beginning of everything. Um, and again, I found them so important that we decided to publish a book last year in Lima, Peru, that talks about the wonderful work done by this very courageous journalist. And that compiles most of the articles. I say most of the articles because there were three issues missing. Um, I mentioned also just a few minutes ago the work of Hardenberg, Walt Hardenberg, who was an American engineer who had gone to that area to work in the railroads that the, they wanted to build and they tried to build in the Madeira Mamoré area, two major tributaries of the Amazon. But he ended up in the rubber state of PAC, of Arana, and he almost died there. He was first perceived as a spy. He managed to leave, went to Iquitos, left Iquitos after he collected issues of these two newspapers and took them with him back to the United States, and then proceeding to London and meeting people who were sensitized to this cause that has to do with human exploitation around the world. And these people were people who belonged to the anti-slavery society in London. It was Paternoster, the editor of Truth, who was a very vocal man. So Hardenberg goes there and published The Devil's Paradise. And The Devil's Paradise contains translation of Roca's articles in these two newspapers. A lot of articles were translated directly from the newspaper. So you can see the work of this journalist, how important it is. Now, going back to my own book and to Rivera, Rivera was aware of this record that I just mentioned, the newspapers, the books that Hardenberg wrote and Paternoster wrote, and the powerful report written by Casement, to the point that after he finished the novel, and this was in 1928, he was thinking about another novel that was going to talk about another terrible extractivist practice in the Amazon, which it was oil, right? And it was going to be called The Black Spot, La Mancha Negra. He never finished this novel. Um, but while he was writing the novel, he decided to draft a letter to Henry Ford, who was thinking at that moment, he was thinking that he was going to make millions and millions of dollars in Fordlandia. Fordlandia was, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but was a place that Henry Ford founded to build what he expected to be, the greatest place to produce rubber, right? And it was a disaster because the environmental conditions didn't allow for rubber trees to be planted and be sustainable. Uh, Fungi came, insects, and they destroyed the whole thing. He didn't lose a lot of money, as some of us would probably think. The investment was great, but he had already at that point extracted so much timber, so much wood, that he was able to sell the wood and make some profit. But the truth is that the whole thing uh, fell apart, and Ford had to quit. But going back to Rivera, Rivera writes a letter to Ford saying, Mr. Ford, I know that you are very eager and very hopeful for to have this project succeed. But I'll tell you, you be careful. You needed to read this this report by case. We need to read these books. You need to read these documents, and you need to read my novel, published in 1924, The Vortex. So you can see how aware this novelist was also when he decided to use what he could do best, which was fiction, to communicate and to denounce the atrocities that were committed in the Putumayo and Caquetá region. And he does it in a very artistic way, right? He always believed that for him to write a novel had to um, include a principle that he deemed uh, very, very, very important, and that was the social transcendence, as he calls, la trascendencia social. A novel must have that. It cannot be just a frivolous or entertainment type of a book, which is something that we can all debate in a different time. But for him, a novel had to be a powerful instrument of social critique. And but being also a man of letters who was very sensitive to the artistic things that novels can do, he, structurally speaking, devised beautiful, a beautiful structure for for this story that he wants to tell. And the story is mainly divided into two parts. The first part of the novel talks about the savanna areas of Colombia, which is very appropriate because he sort of transition into the jungle. And then the focal point, of course, the the jungle, the forest in the Amazon. But in that liminal space, right, where the plains or the savanna meets the jungle, we already start to see trouble, right? Trouble of this type that we're talking about, uh, human uh, human rights abuses, labor exploitation, um, cattle ranchers um, that are very abusive and criminal. But then we also see that there are people coming from the jungle, and this is very clearly found in the historical records, coming from the jungle to hire labor in other areas besides, obviously, the forest. So we have all sorts of people, and Rivera is um, very knowledgeable about the way they did, the way they would use a sort of a discourse to seduce, to um, grab the attention of the poor person who was looking for a better job, better way to live, and would feel that now we have finally a an opportunity to make a lot of money because the um, rubber industry market was obviously exploding during those years. And of course, they leave the savanna areas and they go to the jungle to find a much, much more difficult and, if not a deadly, place to live. This is a pattern that we will repeat later on in Brazil. Um, Robert was mentioning before this talk the author Euclides da Cunha, whom I have studied. And Euclides da Cunha, the Brazilian writer, also in 1905, when he traveled through the Amazon, mainly on the Purus River, he saw horrific things similar to the ones that I described before. And he would write in published in 1909 a book titled On the Margin of History that contains articles that would talk about the terrible system of peonage, the debt system that was installed in that area in the rubber states. As you know, um, I can talk more about that if you will later on. But as you know, whoever would get there to under the dream of making a lot of money um, would have become a slave immediately in that area without any possibility of leaving the Amazonia territory because that individual, for one thing, was in debt, but also he couldn't leave even if he decided to escape because it depended on the modes of transportation that were all um, under the control of the rubber barons. So it became what another Brazilian writer um, uh, coined a green hell for these people. And Green Hell is another beautiful book, um, collection of short stories published by Alberto Rangel in 1908 in Genova, Italy, when Rangel was working in Europe as an archivist. He was collecting data, historical data, and he published this collection of novels. And there you would see scenes that would um, represent the tortures and, in, in some a true massacre that happened in that part of, of the world. Um, Going back to very quickly to Rivera, um, I myself, when I studied this novel, I noticed that the novel had not been um, careful, carefully read from this historical perspective. And in my book, I try to put it back in the conversation because even some very good authors, Latin American authors like Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, for instance. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but these were major figures. They would have criticized this novel in the 60s, in the 70s, right? Because there were these were young writers who were offering us a new way of writing that, with very sophisticated narratives, with different novelistic devices. And when they looked at Rivera's novel, they thought that, well, this novel it's very traditional. It's part of a so-called regionalist movement, which was not possibly perceived by them because he only could be understood by the people who lived in the area and so forth, right? So I thought that it was a little unfair, and I decided to rescue what this authors left to do justice to this wonderful piece of literary art. And and so I did archival research. I went to uh, mainly Colombia, to Bogota, and luckily I was able to find a good portion of the author's library. And to my surprise, I discovered that many, um, among other wonderful things, many Brazilian books that he had in his collection that were annotated with marginalia and things like that. And for me, who had already studied uh, Euclides da Cunha for a number of years and published books on da Cunha's um, narratives, I um, I was very surprised to see once again the link between these two very powerful writers. Da Cunha started his career by denouncing the way the northeastern people in Brazil lived, struck by a drought every year, ignored by the government, different governments, I should say. And so he does a very powerful uh, uh, he does a very powerful critique about that in his well-known book Rebellion in the Backlands, among other things, because this book is it's also about a almost civil war in Brazil that happened in 1897. But then in 1905, when he changed gears and goes to the Amazon, right, leave the desert areas of Brazil on the side, which he had occupied mostly of the rebellions of the backland, then goes to the Amazon. He sees a similar scenario because there, the people who had left the drought looking for better living conditions, they end up again in a region where life was even more hellish, was horrible for them. And these were mainly the people from the state of Ceará, the very northern state of Brazil. So in 1905, he sees some of these individuals living along the Purus River. He interviews them, talks to them. He has some accounts, reliable accounts from people who were familiar with them, and he started denouncing. He started writing about these abuses that were committed in these areas. Um, this does not, and this was in 1905, this does not enter the novel by Rivera, okay? To my surprise. But what Rivera did was to utilize the first major book by Da Cunha, which is, again, Rebellion in the Backlands, and use sort of do a kind of a imitation, right, in literary terms, of what Da Cunha had written in this in his book. So that is the link between these two authors, and the novel, aside from this, uh, uh, aside from occupying itself with these different sources, the novel also, as it should be the case, it incorporates things that have come from the author's imagination. But everything, in my view, blends really well. And I recommend to each one of you, if you haven't read it, there is a beautiful um, thing that he does that to me is very innovative, which is to establish a dialogue between photography and text. He used, for the first time, I think, in Latin America, we have a novel that incorporates photography, not illustration, but real pictures of people to be part of the sort of a fictional game, if you will. And he does very well. And the photographs that I'm mainly thinking of are two of them. There are three that he uses, and two of them have to do with rubber extractors, people who are there cutting the trees, bleeding the trees, etc. But there is so much more that I could say about this, and I'm just looking at our time here. I just don't want to, in the interest of time, I don't want to go on and on, but I'll be,
Well, we will have questions after
yeah,
later, and please, all of you, we will have a period of about 20 minutes, half an hour after everyone speaks. I see you can go on and on. It's a world that I love and find fascinating as I do your work. Again, for those of you who may have arrived late, now I'd like to give the floor to Ann Spice, who's an acting assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Ryerson University in Toronto.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to start by painting a picture of an event. And so I want to take you back to February of last year, of 2020, where on Wet'suwet'en territories, which is an Indigenous community in northern British Columbia, Canada, a police raid descended on a blockade set up in order to stop the construction of the Coastal GasLink fracked gas pipeline. The forces came with tactical gear. They came with semi-automatic weapons. They had snipers trained on people gathered, of which I was one. They came with over 70 tactical officers to arrest 4 Indigenous people who were set up to observe and witness the invasion of the territory. They brought snowmobiles, they brought police dogs, they flew in people by helicopter in order to surround those of us who were gathered to witness. This event set off a huge chain reaction in terms of solidarity actions across the country. In the days following this, and then the subsequent, this was a set of multiple raids. And so a couple days before I was arrested in that raid, there was another raid earlier that was on a different space along this logging road, which is a remote territory. And then several days after, the police descended on the Unistoten Healing Center, which is a space where Frida Houston and other members of this Wet'suwet'en house group, the Dark House group, have set up a reoccupation of their traditional territory in order to offer a space for people to return to territory and heal from colonial trauma. So after this series of raids, the country exploded. There were solidarity actions across the country. Highways were shut down, railways were shut down, ports were shut down. The leader of the conservative opposition accused Indigenous protesters of holding Canada hostage. The Prime Minister was forced to comment. This was made headlines. It was national news for a number of weeks. And was really only, the momentum was really only slowed by the advent of COVID-19 and the way that the pandemic affected people's ability to gather in public safely. So all of these actions were grouped under the slogan, "Shut Down Canada," and the secondary slogan, "Reconciliation is Dead." And so what I think this points to is that the way that resource extraction and pipeline infrastructures in particular continue a pattern of settler colonial invasion. When it comes to the way that the Canadian state is defined, it's often sort of pictured as this kinder, gentler colonialism, or even as a post-colonial space. But what this event and the way that resource extraction functions in Canadian spaces points to is the way that this is a continuation of a pathway of invasion. So I talk about resource extraction and these invasive movements as invasive infrastructures, so pipelines as invasive infrastructure. And I see this as an articulation of petrocapitalism and settler colonialism as sort of evidenced by this extreme reaction to the raids on Wet'suwet'en territories, which were very much focused on Canada. And I think that's the main point that is really important here, that not only was there a pushback against the company, against Coastal GasLink as an industry, but the complaint was really with Canada itself and the way that Canada uses these technologies in order to gain access to Indigenous territories and to continue to contain Indigenous lives and threaten Indigenous futures. And so there's a couple of things that I think are important here. One is that the way that these infrastructures function as infrastructures and mechanisms of invasion is in line with settler colonial technologies on a broader scale. So if we use Patrick Wolf's definition of settler colonialism as something that a movement that destroys to replace, then we want to think about what it is that is being destroyed in the case of extractive industry, and then what is being replaced and what is the replacing factor. And so one of the things that I think in a lot of the literature that's not really focused on is the ways that resource extraction and invasive infrastructures and pipeline infrastructures attempt to replace Indigenous economies. So this isn't a fight between Indigenous culture on the one hand and then the Canadian economy on the other, but is in fact a way of reducing the ability of Indigenous people to make a living off of their own territories. And so this is an attack on Indigenous economies as much as it is an attack on Indigenous lives and cultures. Okay, so I think that this is an interesting discussion to have in conversation with these historical issues around resource extraction, historical instances of Indigenous dispossession and death, because it also relies on the way that the Canadian state historically has dealt with Indigenous people. So the prior attempts at Indigenous genocide, which have left Indigenous people in demographic decline across the Americas and especially in North America, combined with the continued occupation of our territories. And then these further attempts to try and contain Indigenous people in order to extract more from our territories and make it really difficult for us to reproduce our own economies. All of these things then contribute to the ways that something like a pipeline project can become a real touchstone for all of Indigenous resistance on what we call Turtle Island. I'm like being blinded by the light here, so I'm just gonna close my blinds while we sit in the dark, it's better. Okay, so there's a number of things that are happening here. One of the things that is really important in my work to draw attention to is the way that this is not only about pushing back against particular infrastructures, so particular pipeline projects, particular resource extraction projects. It's not only about the threat of spills and contamination, although that definitely is a concern when it comes to especially the building of pipelines across Indigenous territories, but is about the current and future use of Indigenous territories. And so infrastructures and especially energy infrastructures like pipelines always have a future gaze. And so the natural gas and the oil that is being extracted for these projects that are proposed across Indigenous territories is not meant for immediate use in the vicinity of the Indigenous people who are being displaced. In this case, in the case of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, this is fracked gas that is coming and then being shipped to a coastal port where it then will be shipped overseas. So when the Canadian government frames these projects and when the industry itself frames the projects, it talks about building future prosperity, talks about Canada's resource wealth, which is seen as the Canadian government's inheritance. It talks about this particular settler public that is meant to benefit from these projects, and then the possibility, the remote possibility, that Indigenous people may also benefit from the extraction of natural resources. In the meantime, the construction of the projects reduced the ability of Indigenous people to have any kind of dissent around whether or not these projects should be allowed on their territories. They criminalize protest and specifically land defense in the case of Indigenous people. They make it very difficult for people to sustain themselves on the territories while the projects are being completed. So in the case of the Coastal GasLink pipeline and what's happening on Wet'suwet'en territories, it is extremely difficult for people to provide for their families while this pipeline is being completed. There's an excess of traffic on the roads. There's already contamination due to the construction activities. Police are patrolling daily up and down this remote Forest Service road. There's a real constraining effect on people's ability to then be out in the bush with a rifle in order to hunt what they need for the winter. And so it has already had a dampening effect on people's ability to be on the land and to then sustain themselves in that way. And this is after a long history of Indigenous containment. So part of the fight in this area and on many spaces where Indigenous people are pushing back against extractive industry, there's a disagreement around jurisdiction. And in this case, that manifests by asking, when the resource companies come in to ask for, well, they don't really ask for permission. When they negotiate to try and gain access to Indigenous territories, they negotiate with Indigenous band councils, which are set up under the Indian Act in Canada and are really only meant to have jurisdiction over reservation lands. The lands in question where the pipeline's being built are outside of the reservation, so they're part of the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en, and on a space where the band councils aren't meant to have full jurisdiction. And so then we have a question around who is asked for consent when these Indigenous groups are pushing back against resource companies that have found somebody who will say yes, even though that's not an appropriate yes, given the hereditary governance system that is in place in these spaces. So in the end, this ends up being a battle about the current use and also future use of these spaces. So there is a potential of future contamination. There's the current difficulties with access and use of the territories. There's the question of who benefits in the long run when Indigenous people are stopped from having access and full use of their own territories. And then there's a really cliche way of looking at this, which is that it's become a cliche that Indigenous people, we want to look further than one generation. The often cited thing is we're looking 7 generations in the past and the future whenever we're making a decision about the land. But in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, this is actually a really crucial piece, is that the people with decision-making power, the hereditary governance system, the chiefs that hold the decision-making power in that space have direct responsibilities for the health of the land. The names that they carry as chiefs correspond directly to particular pieces of land that, and their responsibility as chiefs is then to make sure that that land is able to feed future generations of Wet'suwet'en people. So looking to the future, looking beyond the sort of energy futures of the pipeline, looking beyond the possible short-term wealth that's accruing to people, to the next generation and the generation after that, especially in the midst of a climate crisis where reliance on fossil fuels is accelerating the effects that people are feeling, especially in Indigenous communities in the North, from climate change and the changing ecology and changing environment. So there's this future temporality that I think is really important to think about in the way and the reason that Indigenous peoples have for resisting resource extraction. It's much more than the building of one pipeline. In the broader visioning of these energy companies, they're not looking only at the building of one pipeline either. They imagine the space of Wet'suwet'en territory as an energy corridor that would house multiple pipelines taking fracked gas and possibly oil from Alberta's tar sands all the way to the coast, to coastal export ports. And so people on the ground there know that this is not it's not the first, and it won't be the last pipeline to attempt to build through the territory, that this is a continuation of a particular economy, a destructive economy that's not only extracting from other Indigenous territories, but also creating destruction in its transport to the coast. And that part of what Indigenous people are attempting to draw attention to is that this economy is not the only way, that we've sustained ourselves through alternative economies, through stewardship of our territories and care for our territories for thousands of years, and that we might consider doing the same given the acceleration towards climate crisis and climate apocalypse. So I think there's a lot to offer when it comes to how we imagine and build ideas around what the future holds, and in how we build relations with our own territories and the beings that are in those territories in order to create more healthy connections with the land that sustains us into the future. Where am I at for time? I'm doing okay. I think the final thing that I wanted to mention is that there's not only the sort of vision of industry, but the ways that those visions also are harnessing Canadian law as a way to criminalize protest and criminalize dissent. So in the case of the raids that happened early last year, they were an enforcement of a civil injunction. And so the company sought an injunction so that they could remove any blocks to access to the territory and begin construction of the pipeline. In response to that, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs evicted the company from the territory and then built blockades to prevent them from entering in January of last year. And so that massive police response, the raid with dozens and dozens of tactical officers, their ability and capacity to use lethal force, that was all mounted in response to a civil injunction. And in the end, there were no criminal charges as a result of any of those actions. So it's striking to me that level of state violence can be imagined and deployed as a way to service a civil injunction as a civil matter. And I think it shows the degree to which the state is backing industry in order to make these projects feel and seem inevitable. And to make any sort of protest or disagreement with the way that the project is going forward seem really dangerous, with not only physically to people who are actually standing in the way and are facing the possibility of that lethal force, but also legally. And I think that becomes a smokescreen for the actual legal state of the land in question. So especially in British Columbia, which there's a whole history around colonization and settlement and how that worked in Canada. Most of British Columbia is not treaty territory. And so there were no agreements signed between the province or the crown at that time and Indigenous people. None of the land was ceded or lost in war. When it came down to it, Indigenous people were moved kind of extra legally to reservations, and then the remainder of the land was claimed as crown land. Now, none of that really has a basis in either Canadian or British law, But the occupation of the territory and the actions of the police on behalf of industry and on behalf of the government itself make it look otherwise. And so despite the fact that British Columbia, definitely this company, and Canada itself doesn't have a really legitimate claim to exclusive use of the territory, they're still able to mobilize the violent force of the state through the police in order to advance industry at the expense of Indigenous people and the use of the territory and continued use of the territory. So it becomes a way to weaponize Canadian law, and I think to make it seem like Canada's claim and settler state sovereignty in this space is more secure and less tenuous than it actually is. I think I'll stop there, and maybe hopefully that leaves us a little bit more room for questions at the end, because I know that there's maybe some in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you. That was absolutely marvelous. A lot of food for thought, and there will, as we said, be questions after. Really fascinating to move from the early 19th century in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, to move to contemporary British Columbia. And, you know, as Professor Spice was suggesting, to historicize what is going on, historicizing this moment. And more ironically, of course, is a great number of Lebanese are very interested in immigrating to Canada. So letting them know what the Canadian state is. And it's seen as a very benign entity, at least internationally. So it's very interesting to get your perspective, which is certainly otherwise. So we'll continue the discussion after my colleague, Adam Waterman, is going to speak on his book, The Corpse in the Kitchen, and the Blackhawk War, so-called. Adam, please take it away. You're muted. I think you're still muted, Adam.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I just said I'm starting to lose my voice, everyone. So if you can't hear me, please, I don't know, yell at me somehow, raise your hands. So what I'm going to do tonight or today, depending on where we are, is sort of walk through the spine of the book, which concerns questions of extraction and how they open onto wider questions of cultural formation, national imperial formations, and the attempted abrogation of Indigenous sovereignties in what is now the United States. The book, as Robert said at the beginning of the hour, is called The Corpse in the Kitchen. The subtitle is somewhat changed. It's now called Enclosure, Extraction, and the Afterlives of the Blackhawk War. So it's meant to evoke the idea of extractive processes as part of the process of what Marx called primitive accumulation, the ways in which originary accumulation created the resources necessary to the generation of, or to the originary generation of capitalism as a social and political form that is in dialogue with, and in some ways underlies the formation of the nation state. And I should say a few words about Corpse in the Kitchen. It's called The Corpse in the Kitchen largely because I like the way that sounds. It's called The Corpse in the Kitchen because the book begins with the theft of the native leader Blackhawk's remains, the Sauk native leader Blackhawk's remains from his burial, and their excarnation over the hearth of a settler family near what is now Bonaparte, Iowa in 1838. Which is to say they boiled his body to remove the flesh from the bones. So it's called The Corpse in the Kitchen because it involves like this weird sort of metaphor for food preparation and murder. The fact of the matter is that there were no corpses, there were no kitchens. A hearth is not a kitchen. A hearth opens out onto the family, whereas a kitchen is sort of segregated. It's a segregated space within a home. It's a bourgeois contrivance. It's something that exists only within kind of a certain kind of middle class milieu where you hide production. Whereas in a settler home, you cannot do that. And so there's a sense in which this act, this sort of horrifying, horrifying act is right out in very much in public in a sense for everyone to see, if not public, and it's in everyone's face at least. And there is no corpse here because Blackhawk's remains were not meant to be a corpse. They were not a corpse. They were made to be a corpse. But Blackhawk was, though non-respirant, which is to say he wasn't breathing, he was still very much alive. He was still very much part of an ecology of life and memory and place and history that was part of what was beginning to anchor the Sauk Nation to the place to which they had been removed after the 1832 war. And his remains were meant to become part of a new ecology of land, a new topography of the land, a new layer of land, in fact. It's for this reason that I would say you can't consider him a corpse. He is his afterlife of his being fodder for new forms of life. This is part of why I argue from the start of the book that this moment, the theft of his body from the burial, is itself representative of an extractive process. It is part of an extractive economy. It's part of an extractive ecology. And this is not a metaphor. This is not a symbol. This is part of an intervention upon the kind of ecological metabolic of Sauk sovereignty in the upper Mississippi River Valley. And so in what I talk about in the book, extraction is not merely a means of accumulating resources, but a technique of settler colonialism as an intervention upon the various infrastructures of Indigenous sovereignty that is predicated on the histories and practices that have shaped the land, that have shaped Indigenous lands, that have shaped the land upon which we all walk when we are in the Americas. So extraction, in my reckoning here, is a form of enclosure. It is the transformation of the braided vitalities of land as into individuated resources, commodities, things. This includes the production of people, their lives, and their stories. Part of what sort of undergirds this argument is the idea that human beings are also participant in the formation of geologies and geophysicalities, that the philosopher Henri Lefebvre famously said that we as humans secrete space. Space is social, and we secrete it. I added to that to say that we secrete not just space, but the actual physical substance of the land upon which we walk and which we live. And that part of what is particularly difficult and galling about this sort of like late, long capitalist moment is that the forms of geological secretion that have been produced by capitalism over 200 plus years are part of what is sort of underlying the larger question of climate crisis that we see unfolding in our midst today. Right. So part of Blackhawk's burial was about the secretion of a geology or geologies, about the creation of new geophysicalities through the creation of new forms of life and new forms of land, new forms of nutrient densities that exist within the land and that support lives above the land, plant life, animal life, air, etc. So what I'm going to talk about today are really the three kinds of geophysical secretions enabled by the Blackhawk War, or the so-called Blackhawk War. The first of these concerns the formation of the Mississippi River as a singular conduit, a conduit for trade, transfer of resources. The second concerns the extraction of lead, which is actually a twofold process, and I'll get to that eventually. First, I should say just a little bit about the Blackhawk War, since I'm assuming it's not widely known. The Blackhawk War took place over about 3 months in the year 1832, between April and August. It was a very lopsided war fought between kind of a ragtag group of renegade members of the Sauk and Fox nations, the Ho-Chunk nations, the Iowa to a certain extent, and fought against settler militias in Illinois and Wisconsin, and then eventually members of the federal military who were brought in to sort of finish everyone off. And it was it was lopsided, but it was also a war in which Native people had the upper hand to a certain extent, because they had a better sense of the terrain. They were more canny about how to move around the terrain. They were also not fighting for pay, which meant that they had more ambition and more interest in what they were doing, whereas settlers were kind of not so much. And the conflict was really about, something quite ridiculous, which was moving the Sauk Nation national home on what is now Rock Island, approximately 100 meters across the Mississippi River, so that they would be on the right side of the river and not the wrong side. So there was something quite kind of weird and arbitrary about this, it's seemingly. And that's kind of the way in which the narrative is told. If you read the historical literature to this day, this is how people talk about what happened. These 3 months, nothing much happened. A lot of famous people were involved in the war. I'll get to that. And it didn't really matter or mean anything. It was sort of an accident of sorts. And part of what I've been trying to do with this book is demonstrate just how little of an accident it is, how very deliberate it is, and how very expansive it is temporally. The idea that this happens over 3 months, it really does not do justice to the ways in which Americans, settlers and colonial administrators had been kind of pouring into this region since 1804 and taking over then from French administrators and Spanish administrators. So there's part of my work in this book was to figure out and to explain to people what was the interest in this region, right? What was the point of doing this? In the same moment in time, in the 1830s, you have the removal, ostensibly the euphemistic removal of the nations of the Southeast along the so-called Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, Louisiana, places like this, emptying out Georgia, Alabama, Florida, forgetting my geography, I'm sorry. Emptying out the Southeast, at least, for purposes of allowing for the expansion of the plantation cotton economy and for the growth of slavery and the slave trade in this moment. So there's generally understood to be an overriding economic purpose to that. Nobody has been able to discern what the economic purpose of the Blackhawk War was, or if there was one. It looks from one angle, from many angles, like a pure sort of nasty kind of either an instance of complete white supremacist, racist nonsense, or a complete sort of instance of outlandish native resistance to something that was really not that big of a deal. And what it took many, many years to finally occur to me, even though it had been staring me in the face for a long time, was that at the center of the conflict was something that no one wanted to talk about, nobody wanted to admit, and goes completely under the radar in the record, which is that the upper Mississippi River Valley, from north of the Missouri in the west and north of the Ohio in the east, sits upon the world's largest terrestrial deposit of lead. And what's more, it sits upon the only deposit of lead, or it is the only deposit of lead that sits upon arable land. Most of the world's lead is in what are generally thought of as deserts or wastelands, places where you can't grow your own food. So the cost of the production of lead becomes prohibitive. And here you had a place where it was all in one place. And you had a lot of it. And when the United States took control of the region after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, 1804, there were all these sort of wildcat peoples, French, Spanish, American, British, already mining in the region, and none of them would admit to the US government how much they were mining, how much they were withdrawing from the mines. And this created a certain kind of problem. This involves a much sort of longer kind of political and military history, but the one of the initial problems that the United States faced when it declared its independence from Britain was that it didn't have enough lead to make bullets. So it didn't have a mining industry. It bought its lead from England. So it was lead poor, and they had to suddenly go and discover lead or open up mines that had been closed for years. And many people got very, very wealthy doing this. And many federal troops during the Revolutionary War were deployed to defend lead mines in Virginia and elsewhere. And after that particular war, it was sort of, everyone kind of realized, well, that can't happen again because we're going to have other enemies. And so the need to strike out and find more lead was very important. Also, the need to control lead was very important. Simply as a matter of being able to control the implements of violence. Right. The US takes control of the Louisiana Territory, which includes the Upper Mississippi, in the same year that Haiti gains its independence, which has already occasioned this huge sort of terror among slaveholders in the South as to what is going to happen to them, their own interests, their slaves, their plantations, and the idea that there are independent miners mining lead and shaping bullets, manufacturing bullets, is really very frightening to the US government in this period. And they begin passing all of these laws to try to regulate production, regulate land use, and to ensure that they know exactly how much lead is being produced in this moment. So this is really part of the strategic function of the Blackhawk War, is to take control of the headwaters of the Mississippi River Valley, or of the Mississippi River, to take control of the Mississippi River Valley, to control both the river as a conduit for trade, and to control lead resources as part of a state bid to assert its sovereignty over the territory that it claims as its own. Right? To be able to claim the monopoly on violence that Weber speaks about. So lead drawn from the mines of the Upper Mississippi goes into killing other indigenous peoples for another 70 years. It becomes the primary site of the production of armaments until well after the Civil War. Rock Island, which is the piece of real estate that the Blackhawk War was being fought over, is still to this day the only place where there is a federally owned munitions plant. So the extraction of lead is part of an ecology of violence. Right? It's part of an ecology of killing. It's a medium of killing. In my book, I refer to it as a way of inscription. It's a way of writing. It's a horrifyingly brutal and effective grammar. Right? Which again is for me not a metaphor, not a simile, because the other application of lead still to this day is in print type. There's a huge expansion in the printing industry after 1832 because the price of lead drops precipitously. And you can see this mapped out in sort of city after city, that there are these type boards that emerge where, not just typesetters, but type facers, people that make type. So there's a corresponding rise in news printing, in book printing. There are new markets for all types of writing, whether it's reportage, whether it's fiction, whether it's history, which really kind of comes alive in this moment. So at the same time, you have lead being used as an implement of killing, of elimination, of maiming, of deliberately altering the sort of material ecologies of the ways in which people live on the land and the ways in which they relate to each other on the land. You have lead being applied as what I refer to again and again as a technology of memory. Right? That people can write away a native presence. They can ignore the native presence, or they can mourn the native presence. But the native presence becomes just that, a presence that is not actually present. Right? Control over the Mississippi River Valley gives you control over lead, which gives you control over the means of killing and control over the means of representation. And while this does not in any way eliminate the indigenous forms of writing and remembering and inscription and indigenous forms of violence and the ways of self-defense and protection, settlers and capitalist ways of accumulating these things to themselves sort of screams louder in the end. It speaks with a louder voice and makes more grandiose claims about itself. Right. I think I'm going to stop there since we want to have time for questions. So
Well, thank you so much. I, found your book to be one of the most creative sorts of cultural histories I've read in a very long time. I know you're losing your voice, and I appreciate you're making a maximum effort. But I love the fact that you are discussing the extent to which it's not metaphorical. You're not finding a Foucauldian metaphor here. It's embodied, and that rings very true in your book and in your analysis. I think it's one of its many strengths is precisely that. It's I'd love to open the floor here for any questions that you may have for our speakers here today. Please either raise your hand or the chat. I'll open the chat box over here. And if we don't have any questions from the floor at the moment, let's see. Here we go. Okay. Certainly, I have a number myself that I could ask, but I don't want to monopolize. I had talked to, why don't we begin with Anne, and then if you have a question in the chat, please include it. I had asked Professor Spice before about Naomi Klein's book in general terms. And one of her responses was that it's an interesting and useful overview. I'm talking about climate change or capitalism. Naomi Klein's argument that you can have one or you can have the other, but you cannot have both. And she talks about the extraction economy in Canada. And Professor Spice has suggested that it's a good overview, but I found very fascinating that what you offered to us was very much an on-the-ground emblematic example. She uses the tar sands in Alberta. I was fascinated by your discussion of the fact that British Columbia is this odd kind of liminal space, which is another tactic for removal of Indigenous First Nations people. I wonder if you could kind of expand on that notion of whose land it is, and that was really intriguing. I mean, they're not even the semblance of treaties or legality or anything else. So maybe we could start there. If you could expand a little bit on that, please.
Sure. So, I mean, to start with, the fact that other places have treaties signed doesn't necessarily make them in any more secure standing in terms of the state or in terms of their responses to Indigenous people. And we know from a lot of the movements in the United States to try and push the government to honor the treaties that, I mean, that's certainly not something that has happened. I think that in British Columbia is interesting. It's interesting in the way that the state positions itself as owner of the territory without a really robust legal standing with which to do so. So this is also in the aftermath of a number of legal cases. And so part of what people talk about on the ground, and I think it's important to center Indigenous voices when we're talking about these things. It's really easy to kind of just jump back to the way that the state is framing their claim to Indigenous territories. The way that people on the ground talk about this space is that it's unceded, that the land has never been given over by treaty, it's never been lost in war, it's never been surrendered to the Crown or to British Columbia. And the province itself, I mean, this actually was an issue for British Columbia when it was looking to join Canadian Confederation. That these treaties hadn't been signed, and under sort of British law, you had to have some sort of agreement. There had to be some negotiation and agreement made with the original title holders in order for state sovereignty to be adequately applied. So there were a number of legal cases in British Columbia, the most important of which is the Delgamuukw Supreme Court case, which on appeal, basically, I mean, it didn't positively prove Indigenous title or Aboriginal title, as it was referred to at the time, but it made it clear who the title holders are, that hereditary chiefs who were speaking for their particular territories were the rightful title holders on Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan neighboring territory. It made it clear also that Aboriginal title had not been extinguished by settler occupation. And so, the Crown's argument in that space is that because the land has been settled, because it's been settled for a long time now, it belongs to British Columbia, it belongs to Canada, it does not belong to Indigenous people. And so claims for Aboriginal title, are too far in the past to really count. And that court case proved that Indigenous peoples' claims to their own territories were not extinguished, were not wiped away by the fact of white settlement in these spaces. And just because the province acted with impunity towards Indigenous peoples and contained them to reservations and sort of moved them off this traditional territory doesn't mean that the traditional territory then doesn't belong to them anymore. Which is, there's a similar move that's made in spaces that are treated, and we can look to the ways that Standing Rock was happening and the pushback to have the Treaty of Fort Laramie actually honored in its original form, and not this sort of really contained, truncated space of the reservation. So I think that there's definitely a legal question under Canadian law. There's no question for Wet'suwet'en people that the land that they've always lived on, is land that they have responsibility for. I think there's a fundamental disagreement about property and what rights property should confer on people. And in a sort of Indigenous worldview and in this particular area, people don't see themselves as owning the land, but instead belonging to it. But that doesn't mean that they're willing to give up the right to access it and the right to use it in the way that, we've always used it. So I think that, there's lots of questions around property and law, and then the way that the Canadian state sort of strategically shuts its eyes to aspects of the law that call into question settler sovereignty over spaces, and instead uses these other legal mechanisms like the civil injunction in order to clear away Native resistance.
Well, thank you. I also thought it was absolutely fascinating that you were talking about the massive use of force for what was a civil claim. That too, I found fascinating, and it is very interesting when these sort of legalistic mechanisms don't even bother with a fig leaf to cover themselves, which leads to my next question, which is to Professor Bernucci about a very similar thing going on now, of course, in Brazil with the president, Jair Bolsonaro, being seen as being a very closely allied to agricultural interests and other interests who have simply expropriated lands in the Amazon, and the extent to which that's seen itself as being extremely detrimental to the climate, that it is an international issue. This is sort of an interesting sort of national sovereignty, international sovereignty, because of course the Brazilian state says, oh, well, it's our, and of course the Amazon is not exclusively in Brazil, but that the Brazilian Amazon is a Brazilian question or whatever. And I wonder if you could make a link between this period that you were discussing and what's going on now with the Brazilian state. You're muted, Leo. You have to unmute yourself.
Well, I think the cliche here that history repeats itself. It's very, it's very true. Um, I've been listening to Anne's and Mark's talks, and I was thinking how, in the case of Brazil, how nations that were in litigious battles, but with the connivance of local officials on both sides, right? Um, that worked for just one cause to enrich the people who were running the industry. You know, at that point, they were friends, but they were still disputing uh, the line that would have, whatever the place would be put, that would have divided their territories, being Peru, Brazil, Colombia. Um, and it doesn't matter if it's oil, lead, or rubber, it's all the same kind of a game and strategy that they adopted and they continue to adopt. Um, as Anne was talking about treaties that have been disrespected or broken, we've seen so many cases in the history of the Amazon, uh, mainly in the 19th century, but even before. Um, and and also what she was alluding to the possession of the land, you know, the so-called uti possidetis principle, right? That if you are there for a certain number of years, you are the possessor of that piece of land. Um, that had been invoked throughout many periods of Brazilian history, but also on the Peruvian and the Bolivian side, um, and, and Colombia, of course, as well. So there's so many things here that are common to what we have heard being in Canada or in southern United States, um, that make me think that there is very little hope for things to really change while we keep having um, presidents, so-called presidents, right? Like Bolsonaro, or the one that we just got rid of it. But God knows what's going to happen in our future. Um, that looked at these industries with totally disregard for the indigenous people or the environment. And these two things are obviously very interrelated. We cannot talk about the environment in these areas without speaking about the, the first people that we know that um, uh, began to live in these areas. And and it's not only disrespect; it's a criminal. Uh, these are criminal acts committed by the governments because yes, on the one hand, we see that there was again a treaty or an accord written that was completely ignored, um, and when the matter becomes a point of discussion at the judiciary level, and I'll just point that one, in the case of Brazil's Supreme Court, you know, there is always that manipulation through the rhetoric of those justice, the Supreme Court justice, that will obviously will be inclined to support the support the industry that is trying to uh, advance its agenda in the area. Um, it seems that right now, from my perception, that the first movement by Bolsonaro, which was very aggressive initially, it's being sort of stabilized by the different protests that took place. But as Anne knows very well, the minute there is an eye that will blink there, from our side that keep looking at it, trying to monitor, protesting. Um, they will try to make their advancement even more and more aggressively. So we have 2 more years, as you know, Robert, Bolsonaro's um, government. Um, the future looks very uncertain in Brazil right now because he has, as Trump did here, he has formed a sort of a Trumpism, tropical Trumpism in Brazil. And believe it or not, there are a lot of people who still think that he could be reelected, right? Um, and in the meantime, you know that the borders of the Amazonia territory, especially in the southern portion of it, are being pushed north more and more by the soy industry, uh, and cattle ranchers as well. I could have eyewitnessed something very, very um, concerning. 1 year that I was there, it was about 5 years. I was uh, in this area on the border of 2 states, the Pará and the Amazon, in the area of Santarém, where the Tapajós River meets the Amazon River. And there is a company called Cargill, international company that has an incredible grip on the territory. If you see what they are doing today, you would be shocked. Um, Thousands and thousands of tons of soy um, leave that area because they have been planted in the adjacent area, more toward the south, where there was pure forest. They cut all the trees, put soybean there in the soil, um, in a place which is not the natural habitat for soy beans. So you can imagine what kind of um, chemicals they have to spray on the plant so it doesn't get affected by the different insects that environment has. So in order to protect the soybean, they use an enormous amount of toxic um, elements there that are in the air. So the population of just that region has one of the highest rates of cancer, lung cancer in Brazil. Um, and many people are not even aware where this is coming from. It's heartbreaking. It's criminal, but yet tons and tons of, um, as I said, soybeans are being shipped to China from that particular area. If you have an overview of the area from an airplane, you would be shocked to see the line of trucks waiting to put uh, that cargo on the ships that will leave later on to China. It's almost like looking in a train, with many wagons in an area that they will never expect to see that kind of image. So um, let's see what happens in 2 years. But in the meantime, things are, I think, a little bit under control, but I'm not very optimistic.
Well, thank you. And speaking of history repeating itself, of course, the Tapajós and Santarém is the region of Fordlandia. This is where Henry Ford built the fake Dearborn in the Amazon, which similar to the soy industry, was obviously not appropriate place to have a rubber plantation, as you were describing, and the remnants of it exist to this day. So the fact that you have an earlier era of the same sort of extractive economy in precisely the same region, it's really fascinating and unfathomable. Bill Hoffman has a question here. We're going to wrap it up in a few minutes here, but Bill, please proceed.
It seemed to me that the theme that I guess I saw running through all three of your presentations was that we're basically talking about power relationships, and those who had more power prevailed. What I'm wondering about, because all of you also brought in climate change in one manner or another and what you had to say, and that's a particular interest that I have, whether you see there is some type of justification that can be built. If you're talking about empowering the indigenous people, it seems to me you have to get a handle on how they wrest power to their own causes. And I would think that maybe that case can be built around better management of the lands. And that this becomes a moral justification, and that may be particularly in an era when increasingly more people are cognizant of the climate crisis, that maybe that's an opportunity for that kind of argument to both contribute to the climate change dialogue, but also help in their power relationships. Any reaction?
Yeah, why don't you, Adam, and then Anne and Leo, and this is a wonderful way to wrap it up. So I love this connection between something that is, I think we all agree, an existential threat, something that is very, unfortunately, au courant. So if you could, connect the conversation we've had here to climate and management of land and empowerment of indigenous societies. Adam, Anne, and then Leo, please. Are you with me, Adam? Yes. Are you there? Yes.
I unmute. I mean, short answer, yes, of course. Do I think the land would be better served in the hands of indigenous peoples? Yes. Do I think that's necessarily an inherent connection? No. But, part of the reason for restoring land to indigenous peoples is, as Anne was saying, about restoring indigenous economies and ways of sustaining themselves as communities, not necessarily in land management for settlers. But yeah, I mean, I think there are indigenous practices of management and sustaining land that are much more effective, obviously, than what the sort of settler colonial capital model has shaped the land to. How you sort of undo some of the effects of what capitalism has done to the land and done to the kinds of indigenous economies and ecologies that sustained those communities and sustained those sovereignties is a bit thornier in some cases. So I think in an ideal world, yes, is my answer.
Well, maybe also, Professor Spice, you could also address this empowerment question, because I think it is, a key question. And you're, of course, an activist. You've been out on the front lines. You've been, engaged in it. Obviously, we talked about the legal mechanisms, but empowerment and this disequilibrium of power, because the stakes are so high. If you'd address that in addition to whatever else you'd like to talk about, please.
Sure. I mean, I think that it you're absolutely right that it does come down to power relations, and often the way that people talk about what Indigenous folks have to offer, it's disconnecting it from our forms of law and governance. And so we have this idea that Indigenous people are innately closer to nature and therefore have the solution to the climate crisis, but aren't willing to hand over any sort of authority, I guess, to Indigenous people when it comes to enacting our own systems of governance. For us, the political element and the way that we deal with land and ecologies are enmeshed. And so you can't have one without the other. We can't be employing our solutions to environmental change and climate crisis without also being able to have autonomy on our territories. And I think that, I mean, this comes back to extraction. There's a real attempt to extract Native culture and use that as a sort of like romanticized solution to climate change without doing the full set of steps, which is to actually imagine what it would look like to have the freedom to enact Indigenous law in the spaces where we've been living for thousands of years. So I think, I mean, it's stewardship, but it's beyond stewardship. And that's something I think people can be starting to do individually, is to like do that imaginative exercise, not only to learn about the nations who have lived in the area that you are occupying in a lot of these spaces, but also to really consider how Indigenous ways of thinking and our ways of building balance and relation, and especially reciprocity with the land, would restructure a lot of these really damaging, destructive systems. I think that people putting themselves in a place where they're actually trying to think through what would it mean for me in sort of daily life, and then what would it mean for the system in general if we were actually taking Indigenous law seriously, and engaging in those relations of reciprocity as opposed to sort of this pattern of extraction.
Can you elaborate? Do you have some sense on what you're saying there about how one takes this on and who takes it on?
I mean, I think if you are living on occupied Native territories, it is everyone's responsibility to take it on. And it will require like a broader number of people actually doing that imaginative work. Instead of the knee-jerk reaction to Indigenous people wanting autonomy, or the sort of talk of Indigenous sovereignty, which I think is fear. It's fear often based in white supremacy, that Indigenous people are going to be somehow also tyrants on our own territories, that if you hand over power or empower Indigenous people to enact our own laws, that then we'll kick everyone back to Europe or something. And I think that there's a level of trust that people need to have that's rooted in really taking the time to build relations with Indigenous people, and that's really the first step, is to build those relationships and learn about how people.
But who starts that? Who starts that? Who initiates?
You do. We're doing it already. So I think that like the places where there's tension, where they're sending in the RCMP and the police to remove Native people, that we need support in those places. And you've got Native people who are doing a lot of the brunt work and the both physical and emotional labor of pushing back against systems that are accelerating climate change. Those people are in jail. And so I think that's where it starts, is like putting support behind the people who are doing the work already, and then learning how to get involved.
Robert, you're muted now. Can't hear you.
Uh, Sorry about that. Leo, if you would just address, I know that we had a correspondence about the leader of the Xingu, I think, whom you met in Oxford, who's the leader in the resistance movement in the Amazon. And you're talking about what, I don't remember the exact phrase, but what a tough old cookie he was. And if you could, again, address this question of, empowering indigenous peoples and the extent to which it's even conceivable in a place like Brazil. And then I'd like to just say a very brief remark before we go.
Oh, look, as I said before, I tend to be pessimistic when I look at the Brazilian case dealing with environment, climate, and indigenous territories. However, I also saw a breaking point from the past last year when indigenous people, it seems to me, are feeling and being more empowered. And how? Through becoming more involved in politics. Last year alone, more than 70 indigenous individuals were elected to public offices in Brazil. So that was a very good day for me when I read the news, because it gave me some hope to see that despite the government that is installed right now, there is this uh, other awareness that it's becoming more and more um, common about where the indigenous people are today in terms of their history, that they needed to be preserved, that they need to be treated in a very human um, fashion. They need to become citizens and have the sense that they belong to the country where they live. So this gives me some hope. But I think going back to what we can do uh, to help them, I think it's by also uh, supporting the press. Right? I spoke of Roca, Benjamin Saldanha Roca, the very brave journalist of Iquitos. And he, in one of his issues, he says, the press is the fourth state, right? We have the executive, legislative, judiciary, and the press. And he emphasized that. He believed in denouncing what he was denouncing through the written letter that becomes public immediately. And so I think we, at the same time, we as teachers and talk to students and make them aware of what's happening, uh, write books and give interviews, have this kind of discussion. We need also to support this vehicle that is so important for us today, because we all know what uh, what kind of danger there is nowadays for the good press to be suppressed as well. In the age of fake news, I think it's more and more important that we stay on the side of the good press and and give them our support. I would just mention something here that you all can I can send this, Robert, but the digital digital magazine Amazonia Latitude by a former student of mine and now a professor at the Florida State University, Marcos Colon, is also a movie director. He has a beautiful documentary on Fordlandia. It's called Beyond Fordlandia that I recommend that you look at it. But Marcos he spent all his time working for the indigenous people of the Amazon. And if you read in one of his digital magazines that comes every 2-3 weeks, you will see the force with which he fights on behalf of the indigenous people.
May I ask in what language he writes?
It appears mainly in Portuguese, but also there are articles in English also.
Good for me.
Yeah, in English as well. So,
Well, that's actually an almost upbeat note on which to conclude. We will certainly, please do send it to us. Leo, for many years, has been involved in a group of scholars who are engaged in Amazon studies from a range of perspectives, hard scientists, biologists, literary scholars like himself, cultural historians. So please do send that information. We'll put it on our website, CASAR, the Center for American Studies and Research at AB. We will also be providing you with information about the upcoming events that I described with Bill Hoffman, who asked our final question here, a series of events on March 10th, 31st, and April 21st. I would like to first of all say thank you to Adam Waterman, to Ann Spice, and to Leo Bernucci. I've done run the center on and off for 8 or 10 years, and I have to say it's one of the most extraordinary conversations. And I leave with a sense that there's very much work to be done. This is the beginning, but to have these multiple perspectives is exactly what we hope we can do and rarely do. So I am extremely grateful to the three of you. I would also like to again say thank you to Serene Hoot, who is the chair of the Department of English at AB that is co-sponsoring this event, to Rami Houri and the Global Engagement Initiative in New York, and last but not least to Iman Al-Kaizi, who is the program coordinator of the Center for American Studies and Research, who helped to put all of this together and has been just an enormous help in a very difficult period. So thank you to all of you. And if you have any questions, please contact me. We will eventually archive this. And please do look for future events on our website. And I do hope this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation and collaboration. So thank you again, Leo, Ann, and Adam. And thank you all for staying with us here for a couple of hours, which was wonderful to see. So thank you so much. And we'll see you again in a couple of weeks, inshallah. Okay.
Robert.
Bye. Thank you. Au revoir.
Wow.